Welcome to this afternoon's program, Getting to Know the Burwells. I'm Brooks Graebner, chair of the Historic Hillsborough Commission, which owns and operates the Burwell School Historic Site here in Hillsborough. Joining me this afternoon are Carrie Currie, our historical coordinator here at the site, and two of my fellow commissioners, Dr. Sylvia Hoffert and Steve Peck. Dr. Hoffert is a retired professor of American history who taught at UNC Chapel Hill and at Texas A&M University. Her area of academic specialization is women's history, and she is the author of numerous books and articles, including writing on Anna Burwell. Steve Peck is a student of American history who has served here at the Burwell School as a docent and a member of our research committee. He is also past chair of our commission. He gives guided tours of Hillsborough on behalf of the Alliance for Historic Hillsborough, so his knowledge of local history is extensive. My own area of specialization is the study of American religious history. Mostly I write and talk about Episcopalians, so it's a treat for me to have a chance to branch out and talk about Presbyterians for a minute. I want to begin this afternoon by calling on Carrie Currie to talk about the 3 videos on the Burwell family that she has recently written and directed, and which form the basis for this afternoon's program. I'd like for Carrie to give us a glimpse behind the curtain, the story behind the story, how she came to make these videos and what went into producing them. Once Carrie has set the stage for us and given us her perspective, Sylvia, Steve, and I will each comment briefly on the videos from our particular areas of specialization. Then we'll open up the conversation among the 4 of us and then to all of you. Just write your questions or comments in the chat box on your screen, and Kate Dubas, our site manager and video wizard, will feed us your questions and will answer as many as we can in the allotted time. So, Carrie, how did these videos come about?
Well, when I first started working at the Burwell School back in 2016, I was a docent. And when I started to learn about the stories of these people who both lived and worked there, I just thought these are prime for a documentary. And since my background is in film, that was always something that I really wanted to do. When we had to shut down because of COVID-19, it sort of seemed like the time was right. Obviously, there's a lot of work that goes into putting something like this together, and we found ourselves with a little bit more time on our hands than we had before. So it was just the perfect segue into that. And it's just a really great opportunity for us. You know, the people that lived and worked there, they're all extremely complicated. They lived in a very complex world. And by creating these videos, we're hopefully able to reach more people than just the folks who are able to come and visit us in person. And we really hope that we're able to encourage some conversation, particularly, and given the climate that we're in right now, on women's history and on the impact of slavery in our country, because those are issues that are just built right into the fabric of the stories of the Burwell School. And, you know, we just keep learning more and more. We keep getting new research materials, we're finding new things, and we've just really started. We've just scratched the surface with these first 3 videos. It's our hope that we're going to do many more and get more in depth into so many of these other stories that are there, not just the Burwells.
Well, speaking of research, what sources did you use to create these videos?
Well, I have to say, we are exceptionally lucky at the Burwell School. We have a wealth of primary resources. We have Anna Burwell's letters and diaries. We have some letters from other family members and from students, and then there's biographies that were done. So those were really the initial things that we pulled. Also, back in the 1960s, when they first started working on the history of this site and these people. These early researchers, someone like a Mary Claire Engstrom, which a lot of folks are familiar with her, they did a lot of legwork, and they collected a lot of these primary resources that we have from the people that were really only 1 or 2 generations removed from the people that actually lived there. So we do a great debt of gratitude for all the work that they did. And then I can't not mention our unbelievable research committee at the Burwell School. They are so involved and so robust, and they just continue to uncover things and research more and more about the people and make the stories more interesting and complete. So when I sat down to write the scripts, I really started with those primary sources, with those letters and diaries. And then I moved on, of course, to some of the scholarly papers, looked at the history of education in North Carolina. And then we pulled in a lot of historic newspapers, which I will mention again, wonderful resources, though sometimes frustrating in their inaccuracies. And then we also recently added to our arsenal the Edmund Strudwick Burwell papers. And those papers are a collection of letters and correspondence between the Burwell family after they left Hillsborough. And so it gives us a broader view that we weren't really looking at before with the resources that we had. So it's really great. And Edmund, as you may know, was the 10th child. So we're really digging in deep with those family resources there, which is great.
Are there resources that you wish you had? Where are the holes in the story of the Burwells, and how did having to work around those holes influence the creation of these scripts?
Right. Yes. There are tons of resources that I wish I had had. Wouldn't it be amazing if we had every moment of their lives from the time they got married until they were no longer with us? That certainly would have made my job a lot easier. But basically, while we have all of these primary resources, we do have huge gaps. Anna's diaries and letters, we have some chunks from the 1840s and the 1850s, and then we have this information from the 1860s, but it is not complete. And that's where we had to pull in some of those secondary sources, like the newspapers, to kind of fill in the gaps, to answer the questions that we had about what was happening at this time or with that instance. So unfortunately, those are wonderful, but not always accurate or reliable. Mm-hmm. So we really had to be careful when writing these to make sure that we could be as factual as possible with the resources that we had. And I think it's important to note that in the past, I would say maybe 10 years, we've gotten access to a lot more materials than we had before, because that original research that was done back in the 1960s, it really just looked at the Burwells, and it just looked at the students, and those are the white female students. And to the best of my knowledge, there wasn't really an attempt to look into the lives of the people of color that lived and worked at the site. And unfortunately, we lost that opportunity to get those same level of stories, those 1 or 2 generation removed stories. And that's very sad to me that we lost that. But what's great is it's really important to the current staff and to the current commission that we tell a complete story of the site, that we are not just focused on the Burwells or on the white female students, but we are telling that broader story. And even though it's still hard to find resources on them today, we're doing what we can. A few years ago, we had a task force that came about that really started this process of collecting the stories of the people of color. And that is phenomenal. We have a lot more work to do. Unfortunately, only Elizabeth Hobbs Keckly, she's the only one that we have a firsthand account of what life was like with the Burwells in Hillsborough. And it's a fantastic resource, even as it's a horrifying story. But unfortunately, when we're looking at the other people of color, the only version of the story that we have is from Anna Burwell's perspective. And, you know, we only have her side of those relationships.
So, Carrie, if you could start a wish list of the documents you wish you had, what would be at the top of the list?
Oh boy, that would be Mary Ann's version of the story. So for anyone that doesn't know, Mary Ann was enslaved in the household of the Burwells, and to the best of our knowledge was with them for the longest period of time. And her story, we know that the Burwells used her as collateral when they expanded their home. She was the collateral for the loan to do the expansion. We also know that she stayed with the family after the Civil War. We don't know why. Did she stay because she wanted to, or did she stay because she had to, because she didn't have any other viable options? Anna Burwell mentions her quite frequently and actually says that she was a friend more than a servant. But what did Mary Ann think? Did Mary Ann feel the same way? You know, oh, it would be so amazing to be able to tell her story without having to use someone else's words to do that. And then you look at the reverse. We have the words of Elizabeth Keckly. We have her experience while she was at the Burwell School. But that's where there's a huge gap in our primary sources related to the Burwells. So we don't have any of the information from the perspective of the Burwells. And I know one particular instance where I think it would be so helpful to tell that complete story. Elizabeth Keckly mentions that her treatment at the hands of the Burwells was not well received in the town. And it seems like that would have been something that Anna Burwell could have written about, and we could have gotten more information, because unfortunately in the Keckly book, it's a little bit vague about what that reaction was. And I just think it would have been so great to know how people really were responding. I think it would tell us a lot more about Hillsborough at the time. And, you know, we're talking about someone, if Elizabeth Keckly hadn't written that book, because we don't have Burwell sources from that time, we wouldn't have even known she lived in Hillsborough. So that's huge.
It is. Now, besides these challenges of finding sources and interpreting the sources that you do have, what other challenges come up when you take on a project like this?
Right. So I was lucky that when it comes to technical challenges, I didn't have to deal with that. Our fantastic site manager, Kate Dubas, did all of the editing and narration for the script, which I am so thankful for. And I know she had a couple of days that were slightly tense because, as we all know, technology is wonderful and frustrating at the same time. But for my part, I would say one of the challenges is we're trying to visually represent ideas from a time period where we have limited images, limited resources to visually describe those ideas. So, you know, we're talking about people that lived over 100 years ago. Surprising number of the Burwell family we don't have photos of or portraits of or any images of. And there were certain scenes where I had to get really creative because it was important to me. When I sat down to write, I knew this was going to be a problem. So I purposefully wrote the story not thinking about what images I would be able to access to illustrate that. So one particular instance that still sort of bothers me is in the Growing Up Burwell video. There's a part where we take a quote from Anna Burwell's diary about Robert Burwell buying a carriage for the children. And I felt that that illustrated one of the ways that he as a parent interacted with his children, and I wanted to share that. But we, of course, have no image of the Burwell carriage. We don't know what it looks like. We don't have any idea. So I had to pull an ad from the Hillsborough Recorder. And that one still, I just still wish I had something more robust to get that point across and to make that hit home. But you work with what you have. And then the other thing is, as I mentioned, we're hoping to make more. We want to make hopefully the next one up is Elizabeth Keckly. We want to do videos on the people of color, on the students, on the teachers. And when you're working with limited images, you also want to make sure that your audience doesn't get fatigued, because we have 3 pictures of Anna Burwell. You're going to see those 3 pictures of Anna Burwell a lot. So, we really had to, once again, get creative in some of the spaces where we put things. But beyond that, and those seem kind of silly in terms of what the biggest challenge was interpreting the stories of these people who are so complicated. Obviously, I am a woman. I benefited from a robust education, and I feel I owe the Burwells a debt of gratitude for the way they sort of were part of that first wave of opening up education to women. But then I have to reconcile that progressiveness with the treatment of Elizabeth Keckly. And that's a challenge. And that's something that, we're still working through.
So Carrie, do you try to put yourself in Anna Burwell's shoes and imagine what it would be like to be her?
I do. I am a mother. I have 2 little boys. And so, yes, I do empathize with her and some of the things that she went through. And that is partially because I feel I did a real deep dive. I spent a lot of time in her letters and diaries and her correspondence with her children. And when you spend that much time with someone, it's hard to not find similarities between them and you. I am also a journaler, lifelong journaler. So, I could just relate to how she might have used her journal to work through things that were going on that she didn't quite understand in her life, or, just trying to make sense of things. And I do empathize. I mean, this is a woman who, she had help. She had a large group of enslaved individuals who were there to help manage, but she had an exhausting life at the same time. She worked nonstop. She was pregnant for basically 20 years. She had 12 children. That I have 2 children that I have a hard time managing, and she had 12 of them, plus all of the students who boarded. I mean, that's just a lot of emotional bandwidth that you have to constantly be tapping into. And then there was a lot of pressure on her. I mean, some of it was self-inflicted because of her personality, but she was also a minister's wife, and there's a lot of pressure that goes into that. She's managing these children. She's working a full-time job. That is exhausting. And so I empathize with her, and as a researcher, I really want to try to treat her and everyone that we're telling the stories of, I want to treat them with grace. I mean, these individuals lived and died more than 100 years ago. We are using private journals, private letters, and taking those to interpret their lives. And I just want to make sure that any motives or intentions that we assign to them in these videos, that we are doing that based on thorough research and a true understanding of the time that these people lived in. They can't tell their side. They can't rebut what we're saying. So I just want to make sure that everyone is treated with grace.
Wonderful. What do you hope that we as viewers of these videos, what do you hope that we take away from this project?
I really hope that these videos, beyond, of course, learning about people of the past, I mean, that's part of our mandate and mission, but I really hope it encourages people to ask their own questions. We're living in a time where these stories are particularly relevant, especially if you look at women's history and current events related to race and gender. The stories of these individuals really can impact our understanding of the time we live in now. And I hope that as we continue to develop the content and create more of these videos, that that people will just really take the opportunity to think on that and to ask those questions and initiate conversation. So that's kind of where we were with the development of these scripts. And now I am going to lob this into your court, Brooks, and give you an opportunity to help us understand a little more fully what it would have been like being Robert Burwell as a Presbyterian minister during this time.
Thank you, Carrie, so much. Yeah, so what did it mean to be a Presbyterian minister in the 19th century South? And where does Robert Burwell fit in terms of those general expectations? To be a Presbyterian minister meant, first and foremost, that you were educated. And that meant you had acquired a classical education at an academy or a college. It meant that you would know Latin and Greek, and you would study mathematics, the natural sciences, classical literature, and Christian theology. All of that was a part of a classical education, and that's what Robert Burwell would have received at Hampton Sydney in the early 1820s. In order to become a Presbyterian minister meant, in addition to having a basic classical education, in order to become a Presbyterian minister meant doing additional work in theology and biblical studies, along with learning to write and deliver sermons. And this was customarily done through apprenticing yourself to a senior minister and studying with that person for a number of years. And that practice was called reading for orders. Starting in 1812, however, leading denominations, the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, sought to improve and standardize theological education in professional schools or seminaries. Princeton Theological Seminary dates to 1812, and so does the seminary at Hampton Sydney. That seminary soon took the name Union Seminary because it was supported by a union of Virginia and North Carolina presbyteries. Robert Burwell, then, is a perfect example of this new trend in theological education. He stayed on at Hampton Sydney and continued his studies there. He received a license to complete his training in the field, which culminated in his ordination in 1830 at the age of 28. Soon thereafter, he married and took his first church. Now, ordination meant you were eligible to receive a call to become a minister in a particular congregation. But a call to serve a congregation did not mean that you would be paid a comfortable wage. As Harriet Beecher Stowe observed, taken as a body of men, the American clergy are generally poor. The salaries given to them afford only a bare support and yield them no means of acquiring property. Their style of living can be barely decent and respectable, and no more. As the daughter and wife of Presbyterian ministers, Stowe knew whereof she spoke. As a result, it was more the rule than the exception for ministers to be bivocational and to seek a second source of income to supplement their salaries. In denominations where there was not a premium on education, this often meant turning to farming. For Presbyterians, the preferred vocation was school teaching. Don Matthews, the premier historian of antebellum Southern religion, writes, Presbyterian clerics often established school as part of their ministry, rendering rather artificial the distinction between teaching and preaching as separate vocations. And that's exactly what we see in the career of Robert Burwell, who transitions from minister to schoolmaster. As for Robert Burwell's theological views, we can only proceed by inference. I'm not aware that he published any sermons or treatises, and none have come down to us in manuscript form. But we do know the history of Southern Presbyterianism during this period, and we do know what was taught and promoted at Hampton Sydney in the 1820s. There are 2 points to be made in this regard. First, the Southern Presbyterian Church from the 1820s to the 1850s was becoming more self-consciously conservative in doctrine and practice. In 1837, the Presbyterian denomination split into 2 separate groups, the New School and the Old School. The presenting issue was how closely to hew to the doctrines set forth in the strict Calvinism of the 1600s as reflected in the Westminster Confession. In this split, Southern Presbyterians were predominantly Old School, and we can assume that Robert Burwell was too. Hand in hand with this theological conservatism was adherence to the view that the Bible upheld the practice of slavery and therefore gave tacit approval for American chattel slavery, and that it was acceptable for Presbyterians, including Presbyterian ministers, to be themselves slaveholders. Now, this was actually a shift for Presbyterians, who in the early 1800s had declared as a national body that slavery was an abomination and that steps should be taken to end the practice here in America. Leading the retreat from that anti-slavery position to a more pro-slavery position was none other than John Holt Rice, who was the chief theologian at Hampton-Sydney. And Rice's rethinking of this matter was happening in the 1820s at precisely the time that Robert Burwell was studying with him. So when we think of Robert Burwell in terms of what we know about the ministerial profession during his lifetime, we can see that he fits into a larger pattern for Southern Presbyterians, more typical than exceptional. But what about his wife, Anna Burwell? Let me turn to Sylvia Hoffert for her comments.
Good afternoon. What I have to say about Anna Burwell should be understood in the context of everybody knew what a minister's wife was supposed to do, but it wasn't really clearly defined. So what was expected of Anna Burwell and her minister wife sisters was dependent on a variety of factors. Number one was their denomination. For example, Presbyterian and Episcopalian denominations provided their pastor with a residence, whereas the Methodist and the Baptist early on depended on circuit riders to minister to various congregations, and they did not want their clergy to marry, and they did not want them to be distracted by a family, and they saved money by not having to provide them with a residence. So depending on what denomination you were would depend on whether you even had a house to call your own. And of course, you didn't own it. It was owned by the congregation if you had one. Secondly, was geographic location. It made a difference to a minister's wife whether she lived in the urban Northeast in Philadelphia or Boston or New York, whether she lived in the South in a little town like Hillsborough, or if she lived in the West. So if you lived in a small town, the expectations, in some ways you would be in view, on call, more than you might have been in a larger congregation where there are other people to take responsibility for establishing Sunday schools and that kind of thing. The third factor that would have played into what was expected of her was her personal background. If she was a Presbyterian minister's wife or an Episcopalian minister's wife or congregational minister's wife, it's likely that she would be expected to be well educated. She should be able to read and write. She should be able, hopefully, to play the piano, sing in the choir, and to have some of those nice middle-class values that and accomplishments that an educated person should have. If she was a Methodist or a Baptist wife early on in the 19th century, that really wouldn't have been necessary because she wouldn't have lived with her congregation in a manse or a pastor's house, and the clergy at that point were not expected to be well educated. They were just expected to be effective in dealing with their congregations. And finally, her temperament would have had an impact on how she experienced being a minister's wife. I mean, some women were outgoing. They loved the social aspect of going to visit and taking care of the sick and, you know, just carrying out the social aspects of her husband's congregation. Other women were very shy and did not really enjoy all of that and complained about it a great deal. Some were energetic and were enthusiastic about being a minister's wife's partner in helping to run the church, and others were more retiring, and they really didn't want to say prayers publicly, and they really didn't want to sing in the choir, and they did not really enjoy the social expectations that were made on them. So what were these expectations? First of all, she is supposed to serve as a paragon of Christian virtue. She was always she always had the attention of people who were judging her as to whether she was carrying out her duties as a good wife, a good mother. Clergymen's children were supposed to behave well and be dressed well. She was in charge of the church's community life. So if there was to be a church social or whatever, she was expected to participate, if not help plan and carry it out. She was expected to be a spiritual leader, which means that she was supposed to be willing to pray in public. She was supposed to organize prayer meetings, Sunday schools, ladies' guilds, and that kind of thing. She was expected to spend some of her time visiting the sick, taking care of the suffering, and helping the needy. She was supposed to be in charge of church facilities. So if there was a church, in the case of Presbyterians, she was in charge of making sure that it was well cared for. And she was supposed to regularly and graciously entertain any guests that her husband happened to bring home at any time of the day or night. In the case of Methodist and Baptist wives, since they had ministers who rode the circuit, often those ministers, or any visiting minister for that matter, in any denomination, could be expected to be welcomed at a local minister's house. There were some things, however, that really irritated ministers' wives. The first thing that they often write about in diaries, letters, novels, and advice manuals, which they all had access to, was the constant scrutiny that they were subjected to. So there's one story about a minister's wife who lives in a small town, and her next door neighbor is the widow baker. And widow Baker assumed the responsibility for supervising and critiquing the minister's wife. And so the minister's wife says, and this is a quote, "Whenever I went out, I could feel her black eyes watching me to see if she could detect in my dress or deportment anything upon which to hang censure." So a minister's wife was supposed to dress respectably, but not too fashionably. If she dressed too fashionably, that would mean she was worldly, that she was spending her husband's very small salary on things that were she didn't really need. And so this would be a cause for comment. And this, I think, continued into the 20th century. I can remember going to church, and every time I happened to be Presbyterian, and anytime the Presbyterian's wife wore a new hat to church, someone had to comment on it. "Oh, she's got a new hat." Not clear what that was supposed to mean, but they noticed, and she heard about it. The second thing is the constant need to be sociable and agreeable. Churches were very political institutions, and they frequently had cliques that had an opinion or had a position to take on something. And so being a minister could be a very controversial thing. Of course, the minister's wife was supposed to be charming to everybody, gracious to everyone, not take sides. And so this constant need to figure out, who has a side that you are or are not supposed to take was terribly exhausting, and they really resented that. And the third thing that was universal, it seems, among ministers' wives was the need to feed and clothe and educate their children, display the trappings of gentility, and run their households efficiently and economically without the resources to do that. Ministers' salaries varied. Episcopalians and Congregationalists paid their ministers the most. Baptists and Methodists paid their ministers the least, and Presbyterians came somewhere in the middle. It's hard to determine what ministers' salaries were because it was individual depending on the congregation, but it appears that the compensation for Presbyterian ministers fell somewhere in the middle between the range of Methodists and Baptists and Episcopalians and Congregationalists. It was the high salary would be about $4,000. The low salary would be about $100. Now remember, this is $100 a year. And the middle was between $400, $450, and that's pretty much what Robert Burwell made. But there was an issue even with making a salary, which was to say that congregations sometimes promised to pay, and then they didn't. Sometimes there wasn't enough cash around to pay. Remember, this is a rural society. It's not run on cash, it's run on credit. And so a minister might find that a parishioner who wants to pay his share of the salary might give him eggs, or might give him credit at his store, or might give him free services if he was a doctor or a lawyer. So you couldn't count on cash to give to your wife to buy the things she really needed to buy. And the most irritating of all of these practices was what were called donation parties. Okay, donation parties were held by congregations who couldn't pay their husbands or their ministers' salaries. And so they would all show up unannounced at the minister's house and would bring whatever they could think of that might be useful without consulting with one another, and give it to the minister and his wife in lieu of a salary. So she could end up with 10 pairs of mittens, or 6 dozen eggs, which of course would spoil, or firewood, or things some things she might need and other things that she didn't necessarily. And they had a big party called a donation party, in which the parishioners who had shown up at your house then eat the things they have brought for you to help support you. So these were all things that really irritated ministers' wives. And anytime they wrote about that, if they wrote a novel about it, if they wrote a diary about it, if they wrote a memoir, they would comment on these. So you have quotes like, "One of the rituals peculiar to a minister's family is the necessity of mingling somewhat extensively in society without the means to enjoy it." Or, "Do not think that I am unmindful of the difficulties which poverty brings, the hindrances to the satisfactory education of children, the loss of intellectual privileges, and the wear and tear on the spirit by the uncertainties of daily supply for even the necessary wants of life. Oh, the money, what can be done without money?" So Anna Burwell lived in this world, and she is fairly typical of ministers' wives. The interesting thing is, when you read her diary and letters, she really doesn't complain about anything but the money. So with that, I'll turn you over to Steve Peck, who will talk to you about the difficulties of interpreting the site that he has experienced in his time with the Burwell School. Steve, it's all yours.
Try to get unmuted. Hello, yes, I'm here. I was asked to talk about interpreting the life and times of Burwells from the standpoint of having been a docent early on in this decade, and continue to do tours and lead discussions at Burwell throughout the years. I came to Burwell, I think, first in memory in the year 2000 or thereabouts. I remember a short tour, and like so many other things in my life at that point, I said, well, at some point I'm going to look at local history, and certainly it became a jumping off point doing work with Burwell and the Alliance. As a docent, I always tried to bring certainly as Sylvia was just doing, some humor to the story of the Burwells, the people who lived at the historic site. I always tried to make it as positive as possible while trying to tell a full story. When I began in say 2011, I don't know the exact date, Burwell had made a significant step in interpretation in giving Elizabeth Keckly a section of the tour, and some mention was made of the enslaved. There was some signage and an opportunity, if one wanted, either as a tour giver or as a visitor, to ask questions about that went beyond what had been gone before, which was basically we omitted discussing African Americans. We omitted Elizabeth Keckly from our script. Fast forward a little bit, 2017, when I became the commissioner, and we were in full participation and preparation for the year of celebrating or a year-long celebration in 2018 of the 200th anniversary of Elizabeth Keckly's birth, and we devoted an entire year to it. So much was changing in the last decade. That significant step was taken, and I was very happy to have joined that. As I said, I think before, my understanding had been that there had been a slow evolution where we began to talk about the enslaved, we began to talk about the whole story of the site. But and as a boy who grew up in Southeast North Carolina, I really understood the slowness to allow an African American presence at a site that was all about white educational advancement for white women, and about those the Burwells, who had formed their school for that purpose. Much of the 20th century, unfortunately, you can characterize as having been a white supremacist interpretation of state history and state historic sites. That's more the norm. In many ways, the Burwell School Historic Site in the 20th century was a lost cause fantasy. I say that acknowledging the debt we owe the existence of the site to early preservationists like Mary Claire Engstrom, who is the godmother of preservation in Hillsborough, and thank goodness for her. But her research generally stopped short of adding the presence of African Americans or the discussion of them. Through the years, I've continued to give tours to a wide assortment of individuals and groups, and personally, I've never had a visitor cut me off when I began to talk about Elizabeth Keckly or the institution of slavery and its all-encompassing whole on the site and on the South as a whole in the period we talk about. I have seen their expressions change, and a few have begun to beg off for time constraints, but that's no one. I'm happy to report that no one ever walked away from my discussions, and certainly my tours evolved very quickly into much more of trying to give a much more complete picture of life at the Burwell School. I'm happy to report, and the good news is that particularly after the Keckly anniversary year of her birth in 2018, I have seen a great deal more demand and request for information on Elizabeth Hobbs Keckly and the people of color. In early 2019, as Carrie said, the research committee issued a report, which I was very proud to be a part of that committee, and the report on people of color and the enslaved who worked at Burwell and built Burwell School. And that's good work that we need to have done. I think I would significantly say, though, that when I was asked to join the research committee as an ad hoc member in 2016, the mission statement of the research committee, and 99.9% of the research being done at that time was being done with mission statement said we were to research the Burwell family and the Burwell students. There was a mention of a broader look at all the people who made Burwell a home or part of that place. So it shows you that the report in itself was a great watershed for Burwell Historic Site, and I think it's reflected in the change of interpretation. Okay, how do you deal with the difficulties? First, I think you tell what you know to be true. I've always begun my tours of Burwell on the front porch. And what I do is try and describe Hillsborough when the Burwells first came to town in 1835. My thoughts is that a historic site like Burwell, without grounding your visitors a little bit in the period and a little bit in the history of the local history, is not useful. I think it's somewhat disingenuous. You want to acknowledge, and I try to in each one I do, acknowledge the changes of interpretation that have gone on that I've referenced before, that how we began to change our interpretation of the site, but also what was Hillsborough like in 1835 through 1857 when the Burwells moved to Charlotte. I begin with the overriding premise that slavery was the #1 critical factor in the lives of Burwells and their fellow white Southerners. And I'm more convinced of that today than ever. If we begin to understand the antebellum period, we must see a pervasive system of chattel slavery that permeated every aspect of Burwell's life. Whether it's religion, justice, the economy, politics, or education. Wealth and privilege was tied around slavery. And I don't think you can understand the Burwells unless you bring that up and have that as a very healthy part of your discussion. The Burwells at one time or another had half a dozen slaves, I think at 1840, that they claimed on the census, and I think it was 10 or 11 that they had in 1850. Now, if you think about only 25% of all whites in 1860 owned a slave, even one slave. The Burwells were privileged and wealthy people to own that many individuals. But they were part of slave society. You can't separate or compartmentalize slavery away from any of it, whether it's the children or the Burwells themselves. And that's kind of where I start with that as an overriding premise. Robert Burwell, as an individual, did nothing to move his faith away from a deeply racist justification for white supremacy. The Burwell children fought to preserve slavery. And again, I try and bring a little reality into my tours, and I usually get a very positive response. You think about the child, Robert, the 5th child, born in 1841. He was born the same year that Elizabeth Keckly gave birth to George Kirkland, son of Alexander Kirkland at Airmount, and both of them fought in the Civil War. Robert, of course, fought for the South. George Kirkland fought for the North. Elizabeth Keckly's only son. And he dies at Wilson Creek in 1861. Robert dies in Charlotte of a gangrene in his leg in 1865. But again, both grew up as Burwells or born as Burwells, at least on their mother's side. And so you have to see that growing up Burwell means more than just growing up white. You had people of color in your household. They were growing up with their children. Mary Ann had 2 children. They were growing up Burwell as well. What does that mean to them? So I try and introduce that. Anna Burwell is a difficult one. I think she she left behind diaries and letters of great value as a mirror to the life of a minister's wife, the wife of an educator, the wife, a mother, all of those things. And there's much praise in her school for white girls of privilege. By a tortured path, one can argue that African American women ultimately benefited from the advances in education that the Burwells were promoting at that time. Their advancing of curriculum. We can also credit Anna with affection with Mary Ann, but we also remember she was loaned out. We also know that from not loaned out, she was part of the loan for real estate. But we also see deep anger towards the servants, and so I think that story needs to be told. Servants were what they called slaves and the enslaved. So that's how I began. That's the premise I work from, but I also don't want to dehumanize the Burwells while I humanize in our time the African Americans and people of color who worked and were enslaved at Burwell. So you don't want to do that. So you have to find that delicate balance. And I think we're trying to get there. And in fact, I think we've gone a long way to do that. So where does that leave us in interpreting the growing up Burwell? I think we must always add, if we're saying the Burwells were great educators and advanced education, they advanced white education. They were children, they were wealthy and privileged by the standards of the day, certainly privileged and very powerful. There were many people who lived under the roof that grew up Burwell that were people of color. We don't know their story, but we do know enough of the framework of how slavery worked that we cannot avoid considering and giving an interpretation of the site that might have included how they lived. We can't compartmentalize slavery, as I said, or the enslaved. It won't do anyone any good to do that. Their legacy to us is to move forward with a clear understanding of the times they lived in. When I say their times, as white and black, and its lasting effects on us all. So with that, I think we're going to go back to a discussion, Q&A.
Hello. Thank you for that, Steve. And thanks to Sylvia and Brooks as well. I feel like I personally learned a lot from all three of you. And I've, of course, talked to all three of you quite regularly on this. So I'm really excited about where we're going. And I think it's a great time for us to kind of maybe get a little deeper onto a couple of the aspects of it. And so I'm just going to start. Brooks, I have a question for you, if you're willing. One of the things that Anna Burwell talked about a lot in her diary was how cold her husband was to her. And I just wondered, was there anything in his education that would have made him respond to her that way? Or was that possibly just his personality?
Who are you asking?
Brooks.
Oh, Brooks. Okay.
Although, Sylvia, you should certainly feel free to respond to those questions.
I think you would have an opinion too.
I think the problem is that we don't know what she means by cold. Clearly, they had an active sex life. So
obviously,
yeah. So is she talking about his public display of affection, or the amount of time he's willing to spend with her? I mean, I think it's too vague a comment for us to have any idea really what she's talking about. But I don't know, Brooks, what do you think?
First of all, I agree with everything you just said, Sylvia. And the only other thing that I can think of that might be helpful to underscore, and it is that the marriage occurs at precisely the time that it needed to occur to advance Robert Burwell's career. It is unlikely that he would have received a call to a church if he was unmarried. And so at the end of his ministerial preparation, he gets married. And I think there was a general expectation that to be a self-respecting Protestant minister, especially in the 19th century South, you would be expected to be married. So it's not clear, as you say, we don't know what the word cold means. We don't know what expectations they carried into the marriage. There certainly is an understanding from the Reformation on that marriage ought to be companionate. It ought not to be just a relationship of convenience or a way to retain property in certain households. But at the same time, it's entirely possible that that Robert and Anna brought different expectations to the marriage.
I agree. Apparently it was a status symbol for educated young women to snag a minister. And they probably didn't understand what that really meant in real life, It was just like, I've been brought up, I'm well educated, I'm a devout Presbyterian, and I can snag, a minister, and it did give women status. I mean, being a minister's wife was important. But it's unclear that they had any real understanding at the age of whatever they married. They had any real understanding of what it really meant to be a minister's wife. And I think that's why so many novels and books and memoirs and advice manuals were published during the early 19th century, is that these women really were pretty unrealistic about what it really meant to be that. And Brooks, you make it sound like they're it's a calculation in a sense, but one of the things that we know about Southern marriages, if you weren't a minister, if you were a wealthy property owner, is that those marriages were incredibly calculated. They wanted to make sure property remained in the family or they could add to their property. So the calculation involved in marriages doesn't mean that people didn't love one another, and it doesn't mean that they weren't happy together. But the fact of the matter is that we know there was a calculation involved on the part of the families to assure that their children married appropriate, like-minded, similarly religious or not people. So I think that it's part of the pattern.
I have one of those moments where I had a thought and it disappeared because I'm still working through everything that you just said. Speaking of the expectations and with the children, were there expectations, and this goes to both Brooks and Sylvia, mainly, were there expectations that, of course, they would have children as a minister's family? I know one of the folks in the chat just mentioned that, the production of children in the marriage did not necessarily mean that there would have been any kindness or loving, which is exceptionally true. But would they have been expected to have children and have such a large family? And then following up on that, Sylvia, I would love to get your take from your understanding of women's history and the relationship that we know Anna had with her children. She seemed to be very involved. And would that have been common for somebody during her time period and at their socioeconomic status? Well,
you want to talk, Brooks, or should I talk about
well, you carry the floor.
Okay. Every woman who married expected to have children. It was considered a tragedy if they didn't have children. But what was going on in the early 19th century was that Northern women were increasingly practicing some form of birth control. Southern women, there's absolutely no evidence that Southern women were. So as Northern women's families were getting smaller and smaller, and they were able to pay more and more attention to the fewer and fewer children that they were having, did not apply to the South. Southern women during this period had many children. They had 12, they had 8. They spent 20 years, more or less, pregnant, bearing children and mourning children, because the death rate for children was very, very high, particularly in the South. So having large families in the South was very common. It was becoming less common in the North. So yes, they expected to have many children. And the second question was the amount of attention that they paid to their children. I think that goes back to my first statement, which was to say that the fewer children you have, the more attention you can pay to each one individually. So when you've got a woman like Anna who is running a household, running a boarding school, running a school, managing servants, she writes in her diary very frequently, so she's spending time on her own self-reflection and that kind of thing. Physically, she could not have had much time to spend on each child individually. She's very concerned about the state of their souls. She writes about that in her diary. It's not clear that she was all that successful in persuading either her students or her children necessarily to come to the church when she thought they should. But she could not possibly have had much time to devote to each child individually, the kind of time that a woman with a much smaller family could have devoted herself to. So it's really hard to tell. She was concerned about it, but it's really hard to tell from what she's written how much time she actually spent with her children.
Right.
Brooks, do you have any?
Right. And speaking of children, Steve, I'm going to toss a question out to you that's coming in from the chat, and that's about George Kirkland, who would have been a very young infant in his time. And the question for that is, and you did answer this somewhat in your talk, but who was George's father? This is the son of Elizabeth Hobbs Keckly, and what happened to him?
Well, Elizabeth Keckly, in her autobiography in 1868, written in 1868, identifies, she did not identify in that biography who the father was, but in an application for a pension based on George dying very early in the American Civil War, 1861, he was killed at the Battle of Wilson Creek, one of the early fights in the western part of the country. She identifies Alexander Kirkland as the father of the child. George Kirkland would have been the man's name. I contrast him because he grew up Burwell as well. Because even though he was a child that left very early after his mother gave birth, and we think that was late 1840, 1841, he goes back to Virginia with her to the Burwell family. And of course, then Elizabeth Keckly is given to Anne Burwell Garland and ends up in St. Louis. But for most of his life, he's in a Burwell household until his tragic death in 1861. So he grew up Burwell. But he died at Kirkland. By the registration he had in the Army, that's the name he used, was George Kirkland. Did that answer what you asked?
Yes, absolutely. And we're getting more questions. I'm just gonna, if the panel's okay with it, I'm gonna start pulling some of these questions from the chat because they're great. And we have a question, was there anything fun happening in the household for the children? Or was it all just dreary and dull?
No.
Students talk about parties. Not quite sure. There were weddings.
Yes.
Yeah, Elizabeth Keckly talks about the dresses that she made for students' weddings. So there were parties and weddings. It seems like they regularly went off to church. Whether they enjoyed it or not, it's not clear. but they did go off to church. The girls went downtown and went shopping. They talked about boys a lot. Mrs. Burwell had a hard time keeping them away from her girls, but she did her best.
Carrie, you also know the story of the boys sledding in the front yard. You might tell that one.
Yes. So one of the things that was in her, it was in a letter to Fanny, I believe. She writes that the weather was really bad and that the boys were coming in and out of the house, and keeping in mind that there's a lot of boys at this point, young boys, and they were sledding down that huge front hill on the dining room chairs, which apparently I had originally heard that she didn't know about that, but apparently she did. And I don't know if she's like me as a mom. Sometimes I'm like, whatever, at least they're occupied. But one of the things that, and this segues a little bit into another question, but one of the things that I found recently in some of the letters was she did ask regularly for her daughter Fanny to send a doll for Jenny. So definitely there were some toys, but I think she said in that same letter, don't get the boys toys. They have enough to keep them occupied, but they did get games. And I hate that I can't remember it, but it was some sort of educational card game or board game that she wanted Fanny to get for the kids, for the young boys. So that was a little piece I found recently that I didn't know about. So yes, they weren't all dreary all the time, which is exciting. And then we have someone else asking, and bear with me because I'm reading a chat here. Do we have any information on the Burwells' lives after they moved to Charlotte, and would that inform our understanding of their Hillsborough stay? Brooks, do you want to address that?
Just briefly, I think we know, that they continued to run a school for young women in Charlotte. And I think it's pretty well documented. It's what becomes Queens College. So yes, we do know what they did. And so very clearly their time in Burwell set them up in terms of a career path that they subsequently followed in Charlotte. And as Carrie explains in Growing Up Burwell in the third video, there's also then from there to Peace, what is now the William Peace University in Raleigh. So the Burwells become very prominent in North Carolina women's education.
And then also we have the Edmund Strudwick Burwell papers now, which we are still processing those as research documents at the site, but those take place during their time in Charlotte. And so we hopefully, as we work through those, we'll be able to share a deeper understanding and maybe tie back more to their time in Hillsborough and how those sources impact that. And I know we're getting close to 4:15. We have two more questions and then we'll wrap it up. Steve, you may want to address this question. Oh, we just got another good question too. Do we know approximately how many were enslaved within the Burwell household at any given time?
It's difficult to say, you know, Carrie. The census records, I think, show around half a dozen in 1840 that are listed on the census records. I think there were 10 or 11 in 1850 listed on the record. We also know the census may or may not have owned them. From the diaries and letters, we find that it was quite common for you to be able to be lent and or you rent a slave, the enslaved, to for instance, they had a problem with their wells, and it seems pretty obvious they brought in either people free of color or enslaved to help them dig the arduous manual labor of digging a well. So while we don't know we only know a snapshot in time of what was claimed, certainly they had slaves. And I think it's important to note that the Burwell family as slavers, part of slave society, go back to Jamestown, and a very large family. And Armistead Burwell, Robert's father, owned 20, 30 at times, and I think that was a large part of his wealth, which is spread out to his family. And Robert probably received some of that after his father's death. His father died in 1841. His mother lived a long time. She would have owned them, but she would have had the ability to have lent them out and or gifted them to different, which she did, to different individuals in the family.
Sylvia, this question is directed at you.
Okay.
You spoke about ministers' wives writing novels. Do you have any titles to share?
I have about 20. They're not in front of me right now. But if whoever asked the question would like to email me, I will be happy to provide them with more novels, memoirs, advice to ministers' wives than they could possibly ever read or be interested in reading.
Wonderful.
Just one that I'm thinking of. I can't remember the title, but Henry Ward Beecher, of course, was a very, very famous minister in the Northeast in the early 19th and middle of the 19th century. His first job was in Indianapolis, Indiana, and his wife was so distraught about being in the middle of Indiana that she wrote a novel, and it's very angry. I mean, it's very critical of what was happening to her. And fortunately for her, he moved on and came back east. But I mean, it's really an interesting one. But whoever would like to have a list of those novels, if they write me at shamu.tamu.edu, I'll be happy to provide you with them.
Wonderful. And maybe we'll put that in an email after so that people can have access to
I'd be
that
happy
as well.
to oblige.
And our last question in the chat, and if you do have questions afterwards, if you think of things later, please feel free. You can email me and I'll get answers from these lovely individuals. My email is carrie@burwellschool.org. But the last question that is in the chat, and I'm actually interested in the answer to this one. If money was a problem, how did Mrs. Burwell pay the free workers like the laundress, Fanny Chavis, or Eliza Chavis, and the yardman Umstead Mayo? Does anybody want to attempt that?
Yeah, they had tuition money, I mean, and what was interesting about tuition money is that unlike today where if you enroll in a school, you have to pay your tuition, people didn't A, all enroll at the same time, and B, didn't always pay their tuition when they were supposed to. So the issue in that sense wasn't that they weren't making money. The issue was, do they have it available when they need it? So that would be the answer to that question, because she writes, I need to buy things when they're available, but I don't always have the cash to do that. So if I need flour, for example, from the miller, he'll come by and he'll have it available. But if I don't have the cash, I either have to get it on credit, which she doesn't talk about doing things on credit, but we know she did because she goes out to pay the bills, which presumes that she was buying stuff on credit. So that was the issue. They got tuition money, but they didn't get it predictably.
One comment I'd make about the issue of money, I think we have a good deal more research we need to do to piece, and we may never be able to completely piece together finances. And I have major questions of how they afforded things in different times. In terms of paying the free of color, there may have been a barter system in that somehow. One doesn't know how it works out. I mean, slavery and those who were free of color it was a system that allowed some interchange of that have barter involved in it and other things. So it's hard to know exactly. But the
Yeah, we just
Burwell
don't know.
finances, the Burwell finances, I personally find really fascinating, and sometimes something of a mystery to me.
Yeah, and I think
There's a lot of mystery.
Yeah, so I think the one thing we can say definitely, Carrie, is they didn't live on his income from the Presbyterian Church.
No.
No.
So there had to be money coming in from other sources, whether that's inheritance or family or tuition or bartering goods and services. I think there were multiple streams.
Right. Well, that's all the questions we have in the chat. Panelists, is there anything else you want to share before we wrap this up?
Thank you for your work, Carrie, on the videos, and look forward to more.
Thank you.
I second that.
Amen. Amen.
Me too.
Well, thank you all for participating this afternoon. I want to express my deep appreciation to the other panelists, to Carrie Currie, Sylvia Hoffert, and Steve Peck, and to the other member of our staff for filming and narrating the videos and for handling the publicity and the technology for this afternoon's program.
Here.
It's Kate Dubas is also a treasure. In fact, it's a real joy to have two such talented and dedicated women as Kate and Carrie working here at the Burwell School. Please be watching for us through email and social media or by visiting our website to learn more about the Burwell School Historic Site and our upcoming activities. Be safe and well, everyone. That's all for now. And again, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks.